I'm Erin. You might remember me from such earlier sessions as the opening keynote and updating your Angular app. Today we're going to talk about web components. I've managed to get some kind of nasty throat infection when I was in America last week, so we might need to end this like through interpretive dance or something, but we'll push through and see how we go. All right, as we mentioned yesterday, web components have actually been around for quite a while. They were first proposed in 2011. But in 2011, everyone was writing jQuery plugins, right? Nobody cared about components. So it was quite a while before they really gained proper browser support. It was only last year that Firefox announced support, and Edge has actually only just getting support as they switched to using Blink as their engine. But so what's changed since 2011? Mostly these days, when we're writing code, we write it with components, right? We use frameworks, and frameworks are built out of components. So everybody's used to the idea of components now. We all think that they're a pretty good idea. The question, though, is if we've got these frameworks, then why do we need native components in the browser? We've already got components in our frameworks. Or to put it another way, if framework components and web components were to fight, who would win? There's a few arguments on both sides. So framework components give you a bunch of stuff you don't get from web components. For instance, they give you an easy way to bind your JavaScript model to your HTML view through things like JSX, templates in Angular, that kind of thing. A lot of them give you change detection. So for instance, Angular gives you automatic change detection through Zone.js. And Vue does something similar using native JavaScript getters and setters. And they give you things above the level of the component, like state management and routing. On the other hand, web components are a lot more lightweight, right? All of this stuff that your framework, or library, I guess in the case of React, gives you, it doesn't come for free. There's a cost to having all of that managed for you. Whereas web components, you're just shipping the JavaScript that you're actually using for your component. The other thing is web components are flexible. You can mix and match them. You can use them with your frameworks or not, or with whatever. There's actually a website called Custom Elements Everywhere, which tells you where you can, which like libraries and frameworks your components, web components are going to work with. And if you look down through the list, you'll see it's pretty much all green. Everything's going well, except for that one little, I don't know if anyone's using this library, React? No? Yeah. There's a couple of issues there with passing in attributes and handling events, but they're working on it. You can absolutely still use web components with it. The other thing is you can use web components with your CMS. So if you don't have a framework, but you still want to have reusable components, as far as the CMS is concerned, they're just standard HTML elements, so you can use them there. So the answer to who would win is that we don't need to fight. So what kind of situations might you want to use web components in? The first is if you don't have a framework, right? Maybe you're building a simple site that just doesn't require a framework, but you still want to have reusable components. Then web components are perfect for that. Maybe you've got multiple sites that you want to share components between, but they're written in different frameworks. So maybe you've got a React app and an Angular app, but they're still under the same brand. So you want them to have a similar look and feel, but you don't want to replicate all that code. Web components are good for that. Or you might have a situation where you want a component that's separate from the framework, which sounds like a weird thing to do, but this is actually how we're using web components where I work for our A/B testing. When we want to inject a new experiment onto the page, we don't want to have to go through the whole normal build and deploy and release cycle with our framework code. So we just build a web component, and then we inject it onto the page, and that's how we do our A/B testing. All right, so now you're all 100% convinced that you absolutely want to use web components. Let's have a look at what they actually involve. So web components are actually 4 separate specs. The first one is ES modules, and I'm sure you're all familiar with that one, so we're not going to talk about it. Second one is HTML templates. HTML templates give you a way to create like reusable fragments of HTML sort of like you do in a framework component. They're super handy, but I'm not going to use them today. I think Gil's workshop tomorrow will be using them, though, so if you're interested, totally check that out. What we're going to look at today is custom elements and Shadow DOM. So custom elements provide you with a way to create new HTML elements, so essentially define your own HTML. And Shadow DOM provides you with a way to encapsulate that DOM. So you can have like CSS inside your Shadow DOM that's not going to then leak out and affect everything on the page. And to do that, we're going to do live coding. Woo! Because 5:30 on the last day of the conference seems like a great time to do that. Okay, we're going to create a custom element with Shadow DOM. We're going to look at some aspects around styling it. We're going to see how we can pass data into and out of a custom element. We're going to add some behavior, and we're going to see how our elements can communicate with each other. Sweet. So the component that we're going to build is this. So now that we've Google Plus isn't around anymore, and Facebook seems to be increasingly getting itself into trouble, I think there's a real opening in the social media market. So we're going to build a social media post. So you can see here we've got the user's avatar, we've got a little bit of content, and then at the end here we've got a way to react to the post. And we've got the three sort of standard reactions. You can react happy, you can be sad, or you can be aerial tramway. And as you react to it, the history of your reactions shows up across the bottom here. All right. So let's switch to an IDE. Okay, so the thing with this demo is I've got a live HTTP reload server running so that it will keep refreshing the page automatically for me, but there's no build system, right? There's no magic. There's nothing up my sleeves. No build system, no libraries. It's all just vanilla JavaScript. I do have a little snippet of HTML here to start me off, which is just a bit of CSS because it's pretty. Okay. So we want to define a custom element. The first thing we're going to do is just use custom elements, which is a global object available everywhere. .define. Now we need to pass in a name for our component. And the one rule with the name is that it has to have a hyphen in it. So if you've got no hyphen, the browser's going to think it's a native element. If you've got a hyphen, it's going to assume it's a custom element. And we're going to call ours tweet post. The second thing we need to pass in is a class that describes the behavior of that element. And it needs to extend HTML element. The spec allows for extending like children of HTML element, like HTML input element, but the syntax is a bit naff, and it's not supported in Safari, and Apple are pretty dead set against it. So for now, HTML element. All right, inside our class, we need a constructor, and inside the constructor, the first thing we need to do is call super. And that is enough to have a custom element, so we can put it on the page now. Tweet post. And if we go back to our browser, you can see in the console here, there's our element, and in Firefox, there's a little link here that will take us to the actual definition of that element. So we can see that it's there. We can't see it on screen yet, though, because we haven't put anything in it. So let's do that. Now, the first thing we want to do is create a shadow root. Now, like I said before, this encapsulates our element. So it stops the CSS inside it from leaking out, but it also provides some encapsulation around how like JavaScript selectors work. So this dot attach shadow. We need to pass in a configuration object with a single property called mode. And we're going to create mode open. And this mode controls whether your shadow root is targetable by JavaScript. So in this case, we can now go back to our console and do a bit of a document.query select. If we can type query selector, and select our tweet post, and we can get access to the shadow root. So you can see the shadow root just here. There's nothing in it, but it's there. Whereas if we made this closed and run the same thing, we get null. We can't access the shadow root there. So do yourselves a favor, make your life easier, just use open. All right, once we've got our shadow root, we can start adding HTML to it. Now you can do this any way that you would normally add HTML. You can use HTML templates. You can use the old document.createElement and append the children. Today, we are going to use good old inner HTML because it makes it really easy to type stuff. Okay, so in here, we're going to need a div for the post. We're going to want a div for the avatar. We're going to want a div for the content. One for our little reaction button. And one for the list of the reactions down the bottom. And a closing div. So now if we look in our browser, we can see our post, we can see our shadow root there, and all of our HTML underneath. We can't see it on the screen still, on the window still, because we haven't styled it. So let's do that. Now, I'm sure you don't want to watch me type all this CSS. So here's some I prepared earlier. And there, through the magic of CSS Grid, we have our post. A couple of little things with this CSS. Up here, you can see I've used this selector host. This basically selects the root element of your, the root of your custom element. So it's basically the shadow root itself. You can also see here the border is set using a CSS custom property called theme color. And that color is actually set up here in our light DOM. So we can, for instance, change this to yellow, and our post will update to yellow. So this is the way that you can pass CSS into your custom element, is using custom properties. They will cross over the shadow boundary. I like the blue better though, so we're going to stick with that. Okay, cool. So now we need to add the content of our post. So the first thing we want to do is to add that avatar picture. And the way that we want to do that is to allow the user, or the person who's using the element, to just pass in an attribute called avatar that has the URL of the picture. So then we need a way to put that in our HTML. So we go into our avatar div. We can add an image with a source attribute. And because this is a template string, we can very easily just add some JavaScript in there. And we can just do this like the same way you would do with any other HTML element. You've got access to the attributes, and you can just get access to the value. And there is our avatar. So the next thing we want to do is add the content of the post. And we don't really want to do that via an attribute, because it could be quite long. It could be full of characters that aren't valid in an attribute. So instead, we want to actually make it the body of the element here. So let me just grab that, because we don't want to type it all out. We can stick that in there. The other advantage of doing this way is that if the JavaScript is slow to load or whatever, this custom element will be on the page with its content, so the user will be able to read it still. In our case, though, we can't see it because this element has, we can see the content here, but now it's got light DOM content and it's got a shadow root, and obviously the shadow root wins because the dark side is more powerful or something. So we can't see our content. So what we need is a way to say, hey, we want to show the light DOM content inside of our shadow DOM. And we can do that using an element called slot. And slot basically creates like a tunnel or a symlink between the light DOM and the dark DOM, the shadow DOM. So now we can see our content here. And if we look in our dev tools, we can see our shadow root. And inside our post here, we've got our slot. And inside the slot, it just links to like the light DOM content below. There. One thing here, though, is that our link is blue because by default, browsers don't inherit the color of a link. They set them to blue. So we need to fix that. The problem, though, is that the link is in the light DOM, and our CSS is in the shadow DOM, and the shadow DOM can't affect the light DOM. So what we need to do is use a special CSS selector called slotted, which will give us access to stuff inside the slots. We need to tell it which elements inside the slots we want to affect, and in our case, it's just all of them. And we want to set the color to inherit, because inherit is the other thing that will cross the shadow DOM. If you've set your, like something to inherit in the shadow DOM, it will inherit that value from the light DOM. Cool. So there we have our color. So the next thing we want to do is add that button that lets us pick an emoji. And we're actually going to do that by creating a whole other custom element. So this is like 2 for the price of 1. It's a good deal. All right, so just like before, we need to custom elements dot define. We'll call it an emoji picker. Emoji picker. We need a class which extends HTML element. We need a constructor. We need to call super. We want to this dot attach shadow. And again, we want that mode to be open. And then we want to start adding our DOM. So again, I'm just going to use inner HTML. And this time we're going to want a button, and I'm going to give it a class of selected because it's going to show which emoji's been selected as the text content once we've selected something. Content of plus. And we're going to want a list of stuff. Now, I cannot for the life of me work out how to type emoji on this computer, so we are going to copy paste. I'm just going to ignore all that indenting. Oh, and then we need to actually add the element to our DOM. So we can do that. You can add custom elements inside of custom elements. It can be custom elements all the way down. There's our emoji picker on the page. Looks like shit though, so let's add some styling. All right. Now, just like before, we're using custom CSS properties to set the color of our emoji picker. So this is a good way if you want to like theme things, you can just get the theme color passed in. But we haven't set that color anywhere. So I'm just going to set it up here. The picker color, need more dashes, is going to be the same as the color of our post, right? So everything is nice and matchy. So now we've got the nice blue border. Now, obviously, this isn't how we want it to start. We want that list to start hidden. So I've got some CSS here. We can just add a class that will hide it. All right, now we're ready to add some behavior. So the first thing we want to do is when we click the button, we want the list to appear. Now, this is just like writing any other HTML, basically, JavaScript elements. We just start with shadow root. We can just use query selector, and we can grab a reference to the button. Start selected equals that. And then we can grab also a reference to the list. And in this case, we can use like a super generic selector like UL because this query selector is only going to run in the contents of our shadow DOM. So even if we had more shadow DOM, like a child element inside of here, we can still use this super generic selector, which is nice. And then we just want to add like a normal event listener. So this .selected .add event listener. It's going to be a click handler. And when we click on the button, we want to remove that hidden class from the list. Cool. So now we click, the list appears. Hooray. So the next thing we need to do is when we click one of these buttons, we want to hide the list, and we want to change the content of the button to show that emoji. So again, we just need to add another event listener. So this .list.add event listener. Again, it's a click event. This time we want to get hold of the event. So let's just grab a copy of the actual emoji that was selected. Right, so that's just going to grab whichever emoji was on the button that was clicked. Then we're going to want to hide the list. And finally, we want to set the content of the button to the emoji. So this .selected text content equals this .value. Cool. So now when we click the button, we can select our emoji, and it shows up on the button. So the last thing that we need to do is then pass that emoji that we've selected back up to the parent selector so that it can add it into the list down here. And we can do that, again, just using a really standard HTML feature. We're going to use an HTML event. So we wanted this .dispatch event. And the event, we can call it whatever we want. Let's say emoji picked. And we need to pass in a couple of config items. The first one, we want to pass the actual emoji that we selected, which we do via the detail property. It has to be called detail. You can't just make up anything. The other thing we want to do is to make sure our event bubbles upwards so that the parent gets access to it. Once we've done that, we can go back to our parent element, which I've lost, and add a listener here. So we're going to listen on the shadow root. We're going to add an event listener, which is going to listen for our emoji picked event. We're going to want to access the event. And then in here, we can just console.log. What have I done? I'm outside of the clock thing. All right, then we can console.log, say parent, and the event.detail. And now if we choose an emoji, oh no, it's not an object, oops. Right, because this needs to actually be a custom event. I do that like every second time I do this talk. All right, so now when we click on our thing, you can see in the console down the bottom there, the parent has received the event. Now in this case, the event is only going to bubble up as far as the next shadow DOM, the shadow root. It's not going to pass over the shadow boundary. So for instance, if we were to add another event listener, window.add event listener emoji picked, and we have the event. Not with those kind of brackets, we don't. And we console.log window and event.detail. You can see that when we send the event, only the parent receives it. It doesn't make it as far as the window. Now, in some cases, this is fine, but in some cases, you're going to want your events to bubble up the whole way to the window. You can do that by just adding another property in your event config, which is composed. I have no idea why it's called composed. It is, no idea. Once we do that, we can add it, and we can see both the parent and the window are getting the event. So you can do it either way. It depends on what's going to work for you. In our case, it really doesn't matter. But let's just get rid of that. Okay, so once we've got this event detail, we want to add it into our DOM. So what we need is a list of emoji that have been selected before and a reference to the particular DOM element. And then every time we receive an emoji, we can just push it onto the list and then update the text content of that reactions element to be the list. So this.reactions.text content equals list. And we just need to join them with an empty string, otherwise you'll get commas in between them, because that's how JavaScript rolls. So now you can see we can choose our emoji, and there they are appearing in the parent element. Cool. So this is all well and good, but it's probably not how you're going to load a component, right? You're probably going to need to do some kind of API call that's then going to load the content or something like that. So let's fake that. Let's just grab a little snippet here, which is going to pretend that we've got the component on the page, and then we've made some kind of API call that has then filled in the details. So we're going to use a set timeout, and after 2 seconds, we're going to set the attribute, the avatar attribute, and we're going to set the contents. So let's just get rid of them out of here. And if 2 seconds seems like a long time to get back this much information, just pretend you're on holidays in Australia. Okay, so if we do that, we can see that we get an error down in the console here. Let me make that a bit bigger. Because we're trying to read the avatar attribute and it hasn't been set yet. So let's just get rid of that so the error goes away. And now after 2 seconds, you can see we get the content, but obviously we don't get the avatar anymore because we just got rid of that bit of code. So how are we going to do that? We need a way to know when the avatar attribute has been updated and then to do our stuff. We can do that. We need to do 2 things to make that work. The first is that we need to tell our custom element which attributes we want to listen for. And we do that by giving it a class property. So we can do that using static get observed attribute, and it does need to be called observed attributes. And this needs to return a list. And in our case, that list is just going to have one item in it, which is the avatar attribute. All right, once we've done that, then we can use a lifecycle function, like a callback that watches the attributes. And this is just a standard HTML element lifecycle callback called attribute changed callback. And it's going to get a name. It's going to get the old value. Oops. And it's going to get the new value. And we can just console.log, say the name and the new value. And then after our 2 seconds, you can see in the console there we've logged the name and the attribute value. So once we've done that, we can just use that to set the image source. So if name equals avatar, this dot shadow root dot query selector image dot source equals new value. After our 2 seconds, we get our avatar back. So that's cool, but I mean, you don't normally do this kind of thing using attributes, right? You probably want to do it using properties. And we can do that as well. So for instance, if we have here selected our aerial tramway, does anybody actually call that an aerial tramway? I would call that a cable car, but apparently aerial tramway is the official name of the emoji. Okay, so we've got our shadow root, and we do a query selector to get access to our emoji picker, and we can get the value of our emoji picker. You can see it's aerial tramway, because we set that property when we changed the value. We can even change the value to something else. And if we read it back in the console, we can see that the value is updated, but nothing's changed on the screen. Now, this is one of those things that your framework components give you, right? The binding between your data model and your HTML. Luckily, this is actually pretty easy to fix in our web component. Just need to go into our emoji picker here and add a setter for the value. So if we add that setter, then whenever the value is changed, we run the code that updates it. Then that will be emoji, and this will be emoji. Should take that 2-second delay out. So now we can set the things normally, or we can set the value programmatically, and it will still update in the screen. Unfortunately, now we've broken this. We can't read it back. That's because if you have a setter, then you need a getter to be able to read it. So we can get value, and then we need to return, like, we need to store it in a fake private property here. So if you're not familiar with this kind of notation, the underscore emoji means, like the underscore in the variable name means this is supposed to be private, please don't look at it. But there's nothing actually stopping anybody from looking at it or touching it, so it's not like super ideal. Proper actual private properties are in the process of being added to the browsers. There is a standard for it. They're just not here quite yet. But once we've got that, this will be a bit better. All right, so now we can set aerial tramway. We can set whatever. We can set our value programmatically. And we can read that back as well. And this, we can create, it's not just the properties that we can set here, right? We can create a whole API for our web component. So if we wanted to allow people to programmatically open and close the list on our emoji picker, we could create a function that is toggle list, which does this dot list dot class list dot toggle hidden. Then I really should get rid of that 2 seconds. Then anywhere that you can get programmatic access to the web component, you can call toggle list, and it will open and close it. So it's pretty handy. You've got everything in there that you can do. I guess you could do everything you can do in a framework component eventually if you're willing to write all the code. Mostly, though, I think that these are super useful as the leaf nodes in your component tree. So the things right down the bottom, the little things at the end. Obviously, that was also a lot of boilerplate, a lot of editing HTML templates, which is not super great because you don't get all of your code completion. The good news is that there are a bunch of libraries available to help you out with that. So we've got hybrids, lit HTML and lit element from Google. Stencil, Slim.js, Polymer, which you might have heard of, which is a whole framework built around web components, and Angular elements, which allows you to actually just build normal Angular components and turn them into web components. So hopefully that has inspired you to maybe try out web components in your next project. I have been Erin. I probably should have said I work at a consultancy in Melbourne called Shine, and we are hiring. So if anybody's looking for a job in Melbourne, Australia, anybody? The slides are available, and the demo code is available online, and that demo has got like code comments all through it, so it's not just a complete mystery. And that's it. Thank you very much. Nobody has any questions, right? Ah, no. One question. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I was doing that in the console. Yep, absolutely. Yep. Cool. Yep.
I started learning Vue.js, and there are also web components in Vue.js.
Yep.
And it seems like it's a redundant thing, the web components in Vue.js. Would it be possible to make the components directly native and then reuse them in Vue?
Yes, they will. Web components will work with Vue. You can build them and then use them in Vue, and then use the same component in your Angular app or your Django, not Django, Drupal, or whatever you like. Yeah.
Would it make sense to make the web components, to make native web components can be reused in many different?
If you are only building Vue apps, I would probably just use Vue, because that's going to be simpler. But if there's any chance that you're going to want to reuse them anywhere else, then yeah, this makes a lot of sense. Hi.
So if there is like an environment company when they're using just like one framework with React
Yep.
or whatever else, does it make sense to use web components if there is no reusing across the frameworks? Some value not using.
I don't think there's a lot of value in building web components if you're just going to be using the one framework all the time. How sure are you that you're going to still be using that framework in 3 years' time, though? I guess is the thing. And again, though, if you could build your web components and say, hey, in case we change frameworks, but then are those web components still going to be relevant in 3 years' time? So, I mean, yeah, it's something you need to work out for yourself. Yo, right at the back.
How difficult is this to download into older browsers?
Sorry?
How can I put this into an older browser?
In an older browser, there is a polyfill available. So it will work in everything except for IE 11. There is a polyfill available. I think that the way that the shadow DOM works means that you need to write code specific for that polyfill for the shadow DOM stuff. I've not done it myself, though. Yeah, we're using Angular elements at work, so it just takes care of it. Anybody else? Hi.
Your web components are using the library code, and you have two web components using the same library. Because the way the shadow DOM is working, would you have to include that library in twice?
Yes, I think so. Unless the library code was available like globally on the page. Yeah, I'm not sure. I've not done that yet. Cool. Anybody else? Yeah.
Publish your web components.
Sorry?
How to publish your web
Just as NPM packages. Yeah. Cool. Anybody else? No. All right, let's go to the pub.